What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome to Psychiatric Casualties. This is Mark.
This is Charles.
And Charles, good morning to you.
Good morning, brother.
For your time.
Yes, that's right. You're just getting up, and it's midday for me here in Florida. You're in Washington State, so
different time zones, but we're on the same mental plane. And we're going to be talking about chapter 3, I believe, in our book.
Yes, Cruel and Inhumane Handling.
Cruel and Inhumane Handling. And this is the first, what we call a dark strategy. And I just wanted to kind of maybe provide a little background of what we mean by that, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right. So, up until this point, we've talked about a couple of things in previous chapters, kind of leading up to this first dark strategy, as we refer to it as. And just kind of briefly summarize that one is the issue of war trauma lessons that are repeatedly ignored and then relearned by each generation since really the American Civil War, but certainly officially after the First World War, where the Army medicine has taken great lengths to document in detail about what are the things that they have learned about how to handle in psychiatric casualties during a time of war, and what were the mistakes made and what they need to do better for the future. And then each generation subsequently, after every war, has written these same lessons learned, if you would. And it boils down to 10 or so fundamental lessons that we identified earlier. I won't go over all of them, but they're basic things like being prepared and having a plan to manage large numbers of psychiatric casualties. Psychiatric casualties have outnumbered the number of soldiers killed and wounded in the battlefield since the Second World War. And other issues like having adequate large numbers of well-trained staff, mental health staff, having a transition assistance program for people coming out of the military, zero tolerance for stigma, treating mental health on par with physical health, and understanding that war stress injuries constitute a spectrum of legitimate wounds of war, just as legitimate as bullet wounds or shrapnel wounds, and taking care of the family. So we identified about 10 of these war trauma lessons that are repeated up through each generation. And the military, as we talked about, has this dilemma about what to do with mental health. And they have two missions. One is to fight and win wars, and the other is a mission of force protection, protecting the health of those who are fighting the wars. And when it comes to mental health, it's created a real dilemma about how do you treat the psychiatric wounds of war while still maintaining a fighting force that could fight and win wars. And that basically has led to where we're at now, which is identifying the reasons why the military has refused to learn their war trauma lessons and fully implement those lessons learned. And by engaging in these avoidance strategies, avoiding those lessons learned and ways to manage their mental health dilemma. And that's the dark side of mental health, military mental health care that we're referring to, is the harmful avoidance of learning the war trauma lessons that end up harming hundreds of thousands or millions of veterans and their families by not properly taking care of those so-called invisible wounds of war.
Yeah, Mark, I think you had mentioned at one time when we were writing it, that this is really the first dark side strategy is among the oldest.
Yeah, that's right. And so the way how I visualized this was trying to go in chronological order. What was the earliest way, since antiquity, have militaries dealt with war stress injury. And the first dark strategy, if you would, the first harmful strategy is one of cruel and inhumane punishment. That, as we go through this, most of the lessons are from, the going back to the American Civil War when it comes to the U.S. military to up to the Second World War. But we'll see some anecdotal evidence of some cruel or maybe even inhumane punishment, even in the contemporary wars too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, anything you want to add to that, Mark, in terms of what you went over?
Yeah, well, just that so in our research, and we spent about 10 years researching this whole issue about military mental health care and getting previously classified studies and scouring the entire literature, Freedom of Information Act, etc. After that 10-year period of researching this topic, we identified 10 of these so-called dark strategies or avoidance strategies of why the military is perpetuating these generational cycles of mental health neglect and crisis, and learning those lessons learned, as we talked about earlier. So this is the first, as you said, the first dark strategy, which is kind of one of the earliest means and primitive means, if you would, about how you deal with the mental health dilemma. Do we treat people with mental health injuries in a humane way? Do we treat them respectfully? Do we emphasize treatment instead of punishment? Well, this first strategy is, just by the title, would suggest that the reflex of the military is to punish and to use as examples in a public way the handling, how they try to handle the mental health dilemma during their eras.
And discipline, of course, is a major one, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But in the case of the military, on page 103, the case of military discipline, the quote from World War I is very interesting. It seems like it lacks respect for the combat soldier or Marine in terms of Washington's quote about discipline as the soul of the Army.
Yeah. Would you, since you have that in front of you, could you read that quote? Just so that this is from the first...
I just have the bare minimum, but let's see. Yeah, sorry about that. Of course.
Okay.
And this is, yes, interesting to note that one of the principal symptoms manifested in these feeble-minded soldiers was a wandering spell, which lasted for hours. In some instances, the soldiers would be found away from his unit in a more or less dazed condition. And then the last paragraph or sentence says, many of these mental defectives were court-martialed for dereliction of duty and often punished when, as a matter of fact, they were totally irresponsible for the acts committed.
Right.
So it's like, where are you anyway? This person is also in the military. It's kind of amazing.
Sorry. Yeah, that was written during the First World War, the American Expeditionary Force, and that was published in 1929. This excerpt, and so mental detectives, they did this one study that quote came from, and they found that 228 of the court-martialed deserters from that time all had so-called mental deficiencies as a result of prolonged trench warfare, that they no longer were willing or able to get out of their trenches and charge across no man's land. And
what are they, crazy?
Well, yeah, that raises a really good point. There's a military researcher named David Marlowe, I believe, and he looked at this whole issue about desertion as from a fight or flight response type thing, how human beings respond to a battlefield. And you have the flight, which is, what some would refer to as cowardice, for example. That would be your deserters and people who go AWOL, who would literally fly away from shots being fired. Then you have the constitutionally heroic, supposedly, who will go on and face the fight despite their fears. And that's the fight and flight. And then we added in our little chapter here the notion of freeze, which is also part of the stress response. It's not only fight or flight, but there's a freeze response that often gets left out. And that freeze response is really captured by, kind of more of a dissociative reaction to extreme stress or traumatic stress, where people literally will freeze. They're not able to move. They may become mute. They may become paralyzed. They may be, kind of have some kind of hysterical reaction, as it used to be a conversion reaction, where they're no longer able to move or to respond in ways, and they become a battlefield casualty. So there's that freeze response as well. But so that's the conundrum, is that for the military, we talk about discipline. We'll go into that a little bit more in a little bit, but is what do you do with those soldiers, those combatants who either flee or they freeze in the face of danger or ongoing stress, and how do you are able to maintain a fighting force to accomplish the military's primary mission of fighting and winning wars? And that is the dilemma that we're talking about here, and we'll be talking about subsequent episodes too.
Yeah, it was interesting. In my experience in the Marine Corps, there was always this constant talk about which is worst. Where did you go? Oh, you went to Hollywood, which is San Diego.
Yes, where I went for boot camp. I went to San Diego.
Okay, that's where
I was a Hollywood Marine. I know.
Yeah, it was annoying initially, and when I got into studying it, I looked it up. I mean, the statistics are basically the same for both.
Oh yeah.
How difficult and challenging, and who gets hurt and all that. But it's interesting. All these years, it doesn't really matter to me. Competition among the branches and all that sort of thing. I mean,
yeah,
I can't tell which is better or worse. It seems like the Air Force had it made. I'm just saying. And then next, the Navy, the Army, it was a mess, and then the Marine Corps. Of course, we're okay. Everything's fine.
There's a little service bias going there, but
yeah. And then I got into the details of it, and no, not really.
Well, let me ask you, because we're talking about discipline. I came in boot camp 1979 in Marine Corps, again at San Diego, and that was the kind of post-Vietnam era. And a lot of the trainings that they had us undergo, in fact, a lot of the uniforms and training and everything was still from the Vietnam era. So as far as discipline goes, and we talk about changes between, generations, when I went through it, they were still physically punishing us for, showing weakness and, not responding quickly enough, or they view it as disrespectful, or just not adding up to what they were wanting from us. That, there would be a lot of physical aspects, little punches to the gut, stepping on toes, of course, a lot of physical, harsh training and things that we would call thrashing. But, that was all meant to instill discipline, right? To build us up, to strengthen us up, and to basically to punish out weakness and to eliminate that as much as they can. So when you went to basic training, what was that like? What kind of how did they dealt out discipline during your basic training?
It wasn't as bad as that. I mean, this was before the war, 1963.
Yeah.
So it was a long time ago. But they were extraordinarily strict, and I would rather actually get punched in the stomach than have to do push-ups all day. And that's basically what ended up happening.
Sure.
I mean, I still am benefiting by it, of course, but nonetheless, yeah, that was bad. But I didn't really see any problems because I was especially interested in, were kids being beaten up because they were perceived to be gay or something? I don't ever remember any incident like that. And it may have happened, but I don't remember anyone actually fighting, which is kind of weird and great. Because I've been in athletics all my life, and there's been a lot of guys that potentially could be, real bruisers, but no. Yeah, I for the most part, all of my training, all of the education that I got was useful. Electronic school, etc. Yeah. I mean, you became a jet mechanic
Well, I think a lot of people go into the aviation field, and for different reasons, and yeah, you had to score on ASVAB, and then meet criteria for, I guess, their mechanical skills. But I should never have been allowed to become a jet mechanic because I did not have very good mechanical skills and ended up breaking more jets than fixing them. So they eventually got me out of that primary MOS, and I did a lot of other things during my time in the Marine Corps, at
The
least.
Russell syndrome,
Yeah,
the steps are going down. Like, what happened anyway?
yeah. Well, let's go to talk a little bit more about discipline. We talk about Lieutenant Colonel George Washington and his his observations about the importance of military discipline, and I think it was 1757 where he's quoted as saying, "Discipline is the soul of an army. It makes small numbers formidable, procures success to the weak, and esteem to all." And again, I think Washington kind of hits it on the head, is that for the military to function, they need to have discipline amongst the ranks. And things like disobedience or people running away or deserting, anything that would be viewed as weakness, straggling, insubordination, disobeying orders, even madness or hysterical paralysis, self-inflicted wounds, or fragging of officers or senior enlisted, the physically attacking of leaders. All those things would be viewed as weakness that would be types of indiscipline that would make it difficult, if not impossible, for a military to accomplish its primary mission. So that becomes getting rid of weakness or weakness in general is public enemy number one for the military. And that's the idea of discipline, is how do you prevent that weakness from spreading from individuals to large groups that result eventually to a ineffective force.
Yeah, it's pretty generally difficult to determine who is weak and who is not. And, the sensitive apparently perceived as weak. It just seems like I understand theoretically that you need that kind of cohesion, really. But boy, it comes at a high cost unless everyone is under scrutiny, including the people that are giving out the punishment.
Well, that's true, of course, but that's often not the case, right? Whereas the focus tends to be on those who are being punished and not so much the punishers. The military leaders who are responsible for delving out punishment for signs of weakness or indiscipline are viewed largely as people who are being good leaders, who are really looking at the morale of the unit and the discipline of the unit and increasing the readiness of that unit by using, again, as much as possible, public punishment as a way to keep people in line and to prevent weakness from people speaking out or speaking against, running away, or in many cases, going to medical for help for their any kind of psychological distress. That they don't make a distinction in the military between somebody with psychiatric injuries to somebody who's deserting because they're a coward and they're fearful, plain and simple, and don't want to, have never been exposed to war, but just the idea of that is enough to cause that flight response. But they don't make a distinction between those who may never have been experienced war, who flee, from those who desert or leave the battlefield, who have served for years in battle seasoned veterans who, we're going to talk about something called old sergeant syndrome that's been around for generations.
Let's talk about that now. It's fine.
Well, sure. Okay. So the old idea of old sergeant syndrome, I don't know how many people have ever heard that, but, it was a phenomenon identified, I believe, in the First World War, and it was studied in the Second World War, was this phenomena of the most battle-hardened, seasoned veterans. Mostly these would be your senior enlisted leaders, non-commissioned officers, staff non-commissioned officers, who have won multiple Purple Hearts and other medals and awards for bravery. These are the proverbial leaders who are the first out of the foxhole and the last back in the foxhole. They lead by example. They are always out in front. And again, they are admired. In fact, they are viewed as the backbone of the military. These are the people who lead by example, who model what any military leader would say is the best example of a fighting warrior, right? These are the sergeants, the old sergeants that they would be called. Old not in terms of age, but old in terms of experience and exposure and being tested and coming through and being essentially the most resilient and hardy of those who wear a uniform, because they will go back and continue to fight and fight and fight and fight and lead by example, right?
And just one more thing, crusty, because if it's a way of sort of letting them go, he's crusty, it's all right, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All the way to humoring and put downs. So see all variety.
Oh, absolutely. And yet, even amongst this rank, the heroic, the old sergeants, right? The pinnacle of a warfighter, they were breaking down from psychiatric casualties. And therefore, old sergeant syndrome was that they exhibited that fight or flight or freeze response. And well, mostly it was at old sergeant syndrome, it was flight or freeze. They would not fight anymore. They were incapable of fighting anymore. And then it really left a conundrum for those leaders. What do you do with these, these pillars, right? These models of heroic war fighters, and now who cannot and no longer are able or willing to continue to fight? And how do you discipline them? And what a problem that is. And so in World War II, they had research about this. They studied, I think it was over 100 of these old sergeants and looked at their backgrounds and, their predispositions, the vulnerabilities. Of course, they found the same, predispositions, weakness, if you would, as they would for the non-old sergeants too, right? Yet they were able to persevere through all that up until a point. And what they found was that they did frontline psychiatry, which we'll go into later on in future episodes, where they were taken off the battlefield when they could no longer fight, and they were given this respite and interventions to restore their physical and mental health, and they were returned to duty, back to their front lines. And 100% in this sample, 100% were evacuated within 10 days or 3 combat days. I'm sorry, within 10 hours of being returned to duty, or 3 combat days. 100% became psychiatric casualties and can no longer be returned to duty of these old sergeants. And it really highlighted for the Army, and these were mostly classified studies at the time, that one, war stress is legitimate. It's going to affect any one of us, no matter how strong and how healthy, how resilient, how battle hardened we are. That is inevitable. Human beings have a limit of endurance.
Everyone has a breaking point.
Absolutely. Everyone has a breaking point. And that's what led to that one study that was previously classified. The conclusion was that psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as shrapnel wounds. And so really highlighting the importance for the military to get on the right side of the mental health dilemma and treat this more humanely, that the discipline approach and some of these other harmful strategies that we'll talk about later on just aren't effective. And you couldn't find a more disciplined cohort than these old sergeants. Yet, and in fact, these old sergeants would be some of the ones who would administer discipline, right, amongst their subordinates. Yet these were the same people that over time, given the amount of exposure, showed that all human beings are vulnerable and will succumb to war stress.
It's kind of like invisible shrapnel.
Yeah, yeah, very much so.
Which
But
is
no less devastating to the mind, the psyche, the body.
that's really been a challenge, these invisible wounds in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and all the other trauma-related challenges, difficulties, whatever. It's very difficult for people who have, again, psychological wounds,
Yes.
to have to explain to other people. I mean, I think one of the reasons why PTSD caught on was that it's explainable. And although the diagnosis may be a bit of a challenge for some people, it clearly is a invisible wound.
Yeah, and sometimes can be visible. I mean, visible by a person's behavior, their actions, how it manifests too. It's not always. Most of what we call these so-called invisible wounds don't stay invisible because there's a behavioral component to it, right? Whether it could be anger and aggression can be a manifestation. Suicide can be a manifestation. So there's overt acts that occur as well, including we'll talk about well, in this next category that we talk about is misconduct stress behaviors, right? A term, again, most people are unfamiliar with, but it's an official category that the Department of the Army has identified. And this is their definition of it, is that it's a range of maladaptive stress reactions from minor to serious violations of military law and the law of land warfare, most often occurring in poorly trained soldiers, but they add good and heroic under extreme stress may also engage in misconduct. And these types of misconduct would be things like mutilating enemy dead, not taking prisoners, raping civilians, malingering, combat refusal, drug use, self-inflicted wounds, again, fragging, officers are enlisted, desertion, torture, intentionally killing non-combatants. These are all examples of the breakdown of discipline and or misconduct that the Army has shown through their studies and now has labeled as misconduct stress behaviors. Yeah. So if I could too, just about that. So they've done some studies in the Second World War. The very first U.S. Special Forces, the Army Rangers, and I'm looking at this, it was 2,639 officers and enlisted personnel, the original Rangers that was put together. And all that on their first mission, the very first Ranger mission in the Second World War, 53 of these Rangers were killed and 91% received high decorations for bravery. And I think over 1,200 received Purple Hearts. And this is after 240 days of intensive continuous combat exposure, right? Well, after the Rangers deployed, they came back, and this is what the study is showing, is that 10% of these Rangers, these battle-tested Rangers of this elite force, were convicted of misconduct, stress behaviors. There were 87 summary courts-martial from this cohort, 160 special courts-martial, which is a more serious infraction, and then 90 general courts-martial, which was a felony offense. And if it's happening within the Rangers, right, the elite of the training, the elite as far as unit morale and cohesion, and there's a very high selection criteria. They're weeded out physically and mentally. You can't get through Ranger Special Forces training if you're weak in any sense of the way. But yet, from this very highly decorated unit, a good 10% went on and developed these misconduct stress behavior reactions.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that the first unit? I mean, weren't they organized then? So they learned a lot from, hopefully they have taken all of that information and improved things over the years, haven't they? It seems like they would.
Well, what has been proven over the years is that regardless of the level of training and morale and cohesion, regardless of people's backgrounds, even the amount of exposure, combat, how battle tested and they are, is that human beings will continue to break down. Old Sergeant Syndrome applies to the Rangers as they did in the Second World War and as it does in the current wars as well. That's the lesson learned, is that you can't stamp out weakness if your definition of weakness is that you're not going to have psychiatric casualties.
Yes.
This is what the first dark strategy is. The military tried to punish those with these war stress injuries, as we'll talk a little bit more about that, how they did that, in order to provide a public example and in an effort to stamp it out, to end the weakness of mental health problems in the military. Didn't work. That's the lesson that's learned. It doesn't work. You can't stamp it out.
What about, I think this issue of distinguishing cowardice and other weaknesses from war stress injuries, is that what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it, for sure. I mean, it's a really difficult bind the military's in. How do you separate out those who might have a yellow streak, right? Those who are exhibiting cowardice in the face of battle from those who are no longer capable of fighting because they are injured. Again, they're invisible injuries, so they're not, it's, if they had a arm shot off or something, nobody would question it, why these people can't fight. But, if a seasoned sergeant can no longer fight, then you're having to grapple with, well, how do we deal with that, and how do we prevent this from spreading to the rest of the ranks? So, if old sergeant is no longer able to fight and we let them go to the back lines, what's going to happen to the rest of the troops remaining, and how's that going to affect the capacity for the military to continue their fight, right? And that is, in essence, that whole mental health dilemma.
Okay, harsh punishment of combatants with war stress injury.
Right.
Next one.
Yeah. So again, we kind of look at this from looking at ancient examples from antiquity, and you have the Roman military, the Roman legions, but they engaged in what's called fusterium. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't speak Latin, but fusterium is the stoning or clubbing to death of those who are either running from battle, who are freezing in battle, who are showing unmanly characteristics in a way to maintain discipline within the legion, right? So it would be a public execution, essentially, that the unit members would take part in either clubbing or stoning together their fellow soldier who could no longer fight. And that was fusterium. But that practice also led to another Roman strategy in administering punishment, which was decimation, and a term we are probably using commonly in lay terms, right? We're decimated by X factor. But what that meant was that they would take a cohort of those who either ran from battle or froze in battle, and they would divide them up in groups of 10, and they would draw straws, and the shortest straw within that group of 10 would be executed publicly. And again, both fusterium and decimation was used to maintain discipline by punishing those, some who may be legitimately, cowards, I suppose, but many of which were, again, battle-tested veterans who had old sergeant syndrome amongst the Roman legion, but they had to be made examples of and were subject to either being clubbed or stoned to death or otherwise decimated. So that's the antiquity view. And there's a lot of other examples that I'm sure are out there, but we just, didn't have time to go into every aspect of how the military has disciplined its ranks. But then you can fast forward to the 17th, 18th centuries in the British and the American navies, and they weren't alone, of course, but they would use flogging. Flogging is the whipping, right? So basically you strip the shirt off a sailor or a Marine who you felt was being insubordinate or freezing or flying in the face of danger. and they would be flogged or whipped. And amongst those devices was the cat o' nine tails, which was a very ingenious way to punish those who stepped out of line there was a whip that had at the end of it 9 slender strips of leather that had a knot tied at the end of it. And that knot was particularly useful in tearing flesh off the body. And they had 9 strips, so there was the cat of 9 tails. And people would be flogged literally to the point of almost death, and sometimes they did die. And when they were done being flogged in public again, so it's to make an example that this is how we deal with weakness, whether it's cowardice or a psychiatric wound. We don't make a distinction. You're going to get the cat o' nine tails, and you're whipped, and then you're taken down below decks, and there's salt then rubbed into the wounds. And that led to the phrase that we use today a lot about rubbing salt into the wound, right? Well, that was actually a practice that was done in order to administer discipline within the military of those who are engaging in these kind of misconduct, stress behaviors, if you will. How's that sounding?
Terrible.
Terrible. Yeah, it's really terrible for that individual. But again, you can take a step back and think, well, what's the military doing? Why are they doing this? And it goes into what is their primary mission, is to fight and win wars. And the way to do that in the military perspective is to maintain discipline and not allowing weakness of any kind for any reason, legitimate weakness versus, cowardice or whatnot, but not allowing weakness to take hold, because the fear is that it's going to spread and cause mass attrition and mass desertion that, lead a unit to become dysfunctional, right?
Yeah, and I think it's probably one of among the reasons why recruitment is always a major requirement and issue within the military. Because if you don't like to be beaten with the cat nine tails, you say bye-bye, not going to do this anymore. And
right,
it's
and
very
you get
interesting
charged for desertion by leaving.
Yeah, right.
Right. They got you over a barrel, and literally. I'll go over real briefly if you would. That how did a discipline get administered during the American Civil War? Dealing again with those who could no longer fight, who froze or who fled. Some again due to cowardice, but many of which were just due because their cuth runneth over. Right? They passed the level of endurance. They had that old sergeant syndrome. So these are some of the punishments used in the American military during the American Civil War. First is branding. Branding meaning that they were branded with hot irons onto their skin, their forehead, their cheek, or their hand. And they were either getting branded with the letter C for cowardice, or D for deserter, or W for worthless. And, somebody with a war stress injury could have been in any of those categories. They didn't make a distinction, of course, about why they engage in misconduct, just that it was weakness and we wanted to brand it. Now we might think that, okay, well, this is the American Civil War, the 1860s. We don't brand anymore. Certainly that branding stopped shortly after. But, we branded American pilots during the Second World War. And they had their name tags and their ranks stripped from their uniforms. Instead, they were given a patch that said LMF. You know what LMF stands for? Lacking moral fiber. These were airplane pilots. These were air crew. These were people who we'll talk about and a little bit later, who were, engaged in heroic actions in the fact, but yet when they succumbed to war stress, were then labeled as LMF. So they were branded. So some of these practices we no longer do, but branding was something that was done. In today's military, we brand people with dishonorable discharge or other than honorable separation. So there's more of an administrative branding. Another tactic, punishment of those who might succumb to war stress, was barreling. Barreling was you stand on a barrel for hours and you're wearing a sign that's draped around your neck, and that sign would say cowardice or deserter. And while you're holding a log on your shoulder at the time, and you're made to march around the camp with a big giant log you're carrying, and you sign that says cowardice deserter, and you're just going on until you pass out. Basically, you can no longer move. So you did barreling was another way. Then there's bucked and gagging. That sounds pretty delicious, doesn't it? Here, a soldier is made to sit for 6 to 12 hours with a gag in his mouth, and his knees are raised and his arms are outstretched. I don't know if you can do that, but it's a very uncomfortable position that you're having to hold for 6 to 12 hours. A thin log would then be passed under their knees and over their elbows to maintain this position, and they would be tied to these logs so that you're forced to maintain these very uncomfortable positions. And that's bucked and gagging. And if that didn't work and you still had war stress casualties, then you get into shackling. And shackling is your legs were shackled together like a prisoner, right? And then you're shackled with a cannonball that you had to haul around, and which really limited how much you could move, obviously, because these cannonballs weighed 32 pounds on average. So those are just some examples, again, before we get into the world wars, but that how the military has attempted to deal with mental health problems and using cruel and inhumane punishment as a way to maintain, in their eyes, effective discipline.
That aren't being used anymore, I hope.
Well, most of them not. Yeah, we talk about branding. Branding was in the 21st or the 20th century, right? We'd still engaged in branding, but now it's a lot, it's not public like it was in the past. And it was meant to be public because that's the whole purpose of discipline, right? Is to make examples of people so that it would instill fear amongst the ranks, that if you decide you can't get out of your foxhole and go attack the enemy, or you can no longer function in your duties, your military duties, that you would be subject to not only physical harsh punishment, but humiliation and ridicule and shame in a public way. That all the onlookers, all your fellow unit members would be taking in this lesson and say, okay, well, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna try to avoid that, or they, as long as they can. But old sergeant syndrome shows that any one of us over time is going to be subject to branding or barreling or shackling or any of these things, because any one of us can break down in combat with enough exposure, regardless.
It just seems, though, that old soldiers, given the duty that they've already performed, and apparently in good shape at one time at least, will be treated differently than those that were not. I mean, yeah, I understand the theory, or not the theory, but the procedures. But it seems like we've all seen this, I'm sure, not just in the academy, but within the military itself, that there's a certain place in your heart for folks that have served with you,
yeah,
and have risked their life as you have, and then they get burned out. I mean, that's one of the terms used, at least outside the military, that a lot,
sure,
for someone who's just had enough. They're done, and
yeah.
So consequently, in the military, there has been no place for them, really.
Well, and that's a really good point, and that is the dilemma again. So they looked at old sergeant syndrome, and they try to rehabilitate the old sergeants by bringing them into the back line, and have them be part of a training unit and using their combat experiences to train up the units. So they have been efforts, and some of those have been very successful. Others were not even able to perform those duties, then eventually had to be discharged. But interestingly, you can look even historically, and you do find some military leaders who have compassion for those who have broken down under the weight of extended combat stress and developed some type of war stress injury. You go back to King Leonidas, the 300 Spartans, right, legacy in the Battle of Thermopylae. And he details letting go two of his Spartans to go back home because they no longer had the capacity to fight anymore. And these were, of course, battle tested, hardened, resilient, right, war fighters that somebody, an enlightened leader like Leonidas, could say, look, no dishonor, no shame, but you need to go back home. You need to take care of yourself for your sake as well as the sake of the unit, so that that the people here can continue to fight, and you come back, get strong, and you come back and rejoin the unit when you're ready. So that seems to be, you get these little slivers of compassion that can be extended. And I'm sure that in many of these old sergeants cases too, you probably had their leaders probably treated them humanely and respectfully as they deserved. But others, I'm sure, were made examples of. Right?
I've worked with the Marine Corps, not anything paid, but I was kind of let in, if you will, as a confidant, and they talked to me how horrible it is to have to deal with suicides. I mean, it's like, what a waste. And they never would have thought of it themselves, but yet they are the officers that are responsible, because anyone in your unit, that's it. And the reactions that they get to their superior officers is, do this right now, as if somehow they weren't doing it hard enough before. I mean, in the current military, it seems like it's a very, very difficult thing to deal with those issues when you're bound by so many restrictions, and you see things that are happening that you can't stop, like the suicides. I mean, it's just terrible.
Yeah, no question. And it's still, as you said, it's plaguing the military today, but suicide's been a problem for the military since antiquity. We talked about the very first recognized war syndrome was nostalgia. That was back in the 15th, 16th century. And one of the symptoms of nostalgia was self-inflicted wounds or suicide. And so, that it's not a new problem, certainly, but it's, you think of it like, what is the way out for some of these people who are stuck between this dilemma of maybe having PTS or some other type of war stress injury, but not wanting to come out forward and publicly because of the fear of stigma and the shame and ridicule, or letting down their units. And also being fearful of being sent back to the back lines, for example, and being labeled or branded in some way. So you think that some of those folks maybe would look at suicide as kind of the answer to their dilemma, their personal dilemma of how they are managing their own so-called invisible wound. It's a problem.
Yeah.
In the discipline, let me talk a little bit about old sergeant syndrome. We already mentioned it, but there was the really good example, if anyone's interested in films, as the Gregory Peck film 12 O'Clock High.
Oh.
Have you seen that, Charles?
I have, yeah.
Right. So it depicts a Army Air Corps during the Second World War, and these are the bombing squadrons that were trying to bomb Nazi Germany into submission. And less than 25% of these air crews survived their first tour of duty. So that's the level of attrition that these pilots and their air crews were facing every time they flew. High likelihood they would not come back. And many of them developed psychiatric problems, as you can imagine. And that was called back then flyers fatigue, or operational fatigue. It's like combat exhaustion or battle fatigue was used as a euphemism for people who could no longer fight. And they were in that either the flight or the freeze response, if you would. But 12 O'Clock High, for anyone who hasn't seen that movie or haven't seen it in a while, it is probably one of the best examples of the whole issue about discipline in the military and the dilemma of mental health. And what do we do with these, sometimes old sergeants, in this case, old pilots and air crews who can no longer fight? And how do we handle that humanely? And the stigma that they deal with and they struggle with. And it's a very insightful movie, extremely well done, and very vivid portrayals about the process of how one becomes an old sergeant and the unraveling of that, and then the responses of those around them when they see weakness. And so I'll leave it at that. But that movie, 12 O'Clock High, it was a 1949 movie, is worth watching for anyone interested in this subject, because those same phenomena are existing today. It just, we got different labels for it and different ways of talking about it, maybe.
Okay, you want to stop slightly early, or is there something else you want to talk about?
Well, I think, we're going to talk in the next episode, go into some more examples of some cruel and inhumane punishment. And I have to warn the listeners that some of the things that we're going to talk about have never been made public before, and might be quite shocking. So, a trigger warning might be necessary here. But yeah, this might be a good time to stop and for us to kind of catch our breath, and then we'll come back to this next episode, and we'll finish up on this chapter of cruel and inhumane punishment, the first dark strategy. Until then, see you, Charles.
Okay, see you soon.